Oregon Police Chief Mike Navarre, thanks for joining me. How are you interacting with community activists?
Well, in the city of Oregon, up until the shooting that we had on June 13, I had talked to a couple of our ministers. We have a minister named Jonathan Davis. I wouldn't consider him a community activist. For the most part, most of what was going on in Toledo wasn't occurring in Oregon. We did have some protests in Oregon. We had, I think, a total of 4. The largest one was the week before the shooting that happened, and there were like 200 people there. And those were activists that were all from Toledo. But I guess in terms of how do I interact with them, I meet with them before the rally started, tried to get what their intent was so that we can make sure that the rally and the parade and the march went off without anybody getting hurt. But I haven't had a lot of interaction about issues involving police reform until the night of the shooting and the next day. I had a lot of interaction the next day with several people, mostly from Toledo, but some of those were family members.
There's a lot of African Americans in our community who feel they are being treated unfairly by police departments. What discussions have you had with those people when you had the time to?
Well, I have been an advocate for police reform for many, many years. I think that's very evident by the fact that I volunteered as the only chief in the state of Ohio to sit on a task force for the purpose of improving police community relations. I recognize that we have a problem. We have been trying to make changes, trying to put some of these reforms in place. I haven't gotten a lot of support from my own chiefs in the state of Ohio, and I haven't gotten a lot of support from elected officials. I believe that we have reached an opportune time in our country and in the state of Ohio to enact some of those police reforms. The country was outraged from what they saw in Minneapolis, and it wasn't just the African American population, it was the entire population. These protests that I participated in were very diverse, and they were diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, age, and rich and poor. People want change, and I think we need change. And I think if we miss on this opportunity, then shame on us.
You're running for sheriff, and if you become sheriff, what police reform will you bring to the Toledo-Lucas County area?
Well, as the sheriff, I would be the chief law enforcement officer in Lucas County. Now, when I served as the chief in Toledo, I was the chief for 13 and a half years. I was in a very high profile, very prominent position. And the chief in the city of Toledo, along with the sheriff, are really the 2 persons in Lucas County that can really garner the most respect and get people to change. Now, we're very fortunate right now because we've got a chief in Toledo who is very passionate about his police department and changing the way we police in this country. And if we can't get changes on the national level, I am quite certain we can get them on the state level because we've got a governor that is behind it. There will be some resistance, but I think in the end, we're going to be able to make a lot of major changes for the better.
How has the Oregon Police Department improved relations with the community that it serves?
Well, Oregon is a combination of rural and urban. A lot of it is rural. It is not very diverse. The African American population in the city of Oregon, I believe, is less than 2%. And the Hispanic population is just slightly higher than that. So generally, it is a Caucasian community. We do have a population that visits our city that is more diverse than the population that lives in the city because of the shopping that is available along Route 2. We draw a lot of customers from North Toledo and downtown area, lower South End, and East Toledo. So we do have a lot of contact with a diverse population. But in terms of meeting with community groups that live in Oregon and meeting with Block Watch groups, and there's only a handful in Oregon, and meeting with different social groups like the Oregonian Club, it is generally a non-diverse group that I'm meeting with. It's mainly a white group. So to be quite honest with you, I don't have a lot of contact with African Americans or Hispanics as part of my official duties in the city of Oregon. Completely different than what I dealt with when I was the chief in Toledo.
A lot of protesters, they want accountability for police officers. They don't want anyone above the law. How will you, as Oregon Police Chief and Sheriff candidate, implement officer accountability in our area?
Accountability is extremely important. That's been a problem that has been around law enforcement agencies for quite some time. I think we have made a giant stride with the implementation of dash cam videos in all of our police cars and body cam videos that all of our officers wear. So literally every interaction that we have with the community is video recorded and audio recorded. So if we do get a complaint, we can go back and take a look at it. And that, when we implemented that type of technology in the city of Toledo, the number of citizen complaints went way down. And I think that is probably down the road, it's going to be a mandate across the country for police departments. It's somewhat of a expensive project, but I think it's a good investment in terms of holding officers accountable. It really comes down to training. You have to hire the right officers and you have to train them. And not everyone is cut out to be a police officer. And that doesn't mean they're a bad person. It's a tough job. It's a very difficult job. It's a very dangerous job. And some people just aren't cut out for it. And you have to make the tough decisions as a chief of police and let people go. And I have done that. It's not a good experience to let someone go, but not oftentimes, but on occasion, it has to be done. And that really goes back to what the public wants. They want accountability. So when officers screw up, they have to be held accountable. They have to be disciplined.
The city of Toledo set up an email address for people to submit video and audio of officers' behavior. How will you, as Oregon Police Chief, implement something similar to that if you don't already have something like that in place?
Well, I can tell you that the difference between Oregon and Toledo is night and day. Having served in both agencies, we get very few complaints. We have several mechanisms for people to make complaints. I am very accessible to every member of the community. They can call me and I will answer the phone. They can email me just like you did, and I will respond to that email. And if they have anything, and we have something on our website that kind of addresses how to file a complaint, but we get very few complaints. I mean, we get like literally one or two a year. And oftentimes it's a misunderstanding, and we usually can resolve it by pulling the video and the audio and seeing what happened and clearing, if it is a misunderstanding, clearing it up. But we don't really have, it's comparing apples to oranges, comparing Oregon to Toledo.
Excessive force has become deadly and it's been seen across the news. What is the standard definition for when excessive force should be used in your department's manual?
Well, most departments use what's considered a continuum of force. And officers, on occasion, have to use force. I mean, that's the nature of the job. And depending on what type of resistance that they are being met with, they have different tools that they can use. They have mace. Mace is might be used for minor resistance. Someone uh, who just doesn't want to cooperate and fights with the officer, doesn't want to put their hands behind their back. Our officers are trained to use an expandable asp to strike pressure points, not to where they're going to break any bones, and we never strike anybody in the head. But that's a tool that is used for a little bit higher level of resistance. And they have tasers. And oftentimes, just the presence of the taser gains compliance from someone. And then, of course, there's the use of deadly force. And deadly force is using their handgun. And that is reserved for those situations where they are facing a situation where their life is in danger, or the life of another person, maybe their partner, maybe an innocent person. Uh, and the last situation where deadly force can be used, and it's kind of a legal technical definition, but it came out of the Supreme Court in the Garner versus Tennessee decision in 1985, is when you can use deadly force to apprehend a fleeing felon. And that's a very high standard that has to be met. Prior to that Supreme Court decision in 1985, police officers across the country were legally allowed to shoot fleeing felons in the back for property type offenses like garage break-in. In fact, the case that precipitated that decision, it was a 15-year-old African-American youth, lived in Memphis, Tennessee, and he had broken into either a house or a garage and was fleeing the scene when the officers arrived on the scene. And he was climbing a fence, and they shot him in the back and they killed him. And prior to that decision, and it took 11 years for the Supreme Court to reach that decision, that was a legal use of deadly force. But that all changed with Garner versus Tennessee. And that is the one that really becomes the most controversial across the country, when officers use deadly force, and whether it has reached that point where, and the standard is very difficult, it has to be an offense of violence, and there has to be probable cause that that person, if allowed to escape, is going to continue to commit a felony offense of violence. So it's a tough standard to meet. And that is really the one that is, I mean, that's exactly what the discussion was down in Atlanta with the most recent case involving the man that was shot with the taser in his hand. So deadly force, for the most part, is governed by department policy, but it has to be consistent with those Supreme Court decisions, because that's the law of the land. And Garner versus Tennessee is the critical one. And then there was another one that came later. It was called Graham versus Connor, and that kind of it kind of took Garner versus Tennessee and said that you have to consider a totality of all the circumstances. But I'm getting into constitutional law, and you'd have to take an entire class just to understand those two, because they're very complex. And we drill that into our officers because they need to know that. They need to know when they can legally use deadly force or any type of force. We don't want them to use force. We want that to be a last resort. But the fact of the matter is, the nature of the work requires it on occasion.
You've listed some examples of when deadly force has been used. When you look at African Americans like Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks, what alternative actions should have been taken there, excluding deadly force? What else could have been done, if there is something else that could have been done?
Well, keep in mind, I know only what I see on television and read in the newspapers about each of these cases. And each one of them is different and unique. I mean, Minneapolis might be the easiest one to analyze because he used a chokehold, which incidentally was authorized by the Minneapolis Police Department. They were allowed to use chokeholds as part of their use of force continuum. And never did we allow that in Oregon. Never did we allow that in Toledo. But a lot of departments allowed chokeholds. But he used it on a person, Mr. Floyd, who was handcuffed behind his back. I presume, from what I've heard, that he was in the car handcuffed and they had trouble restraining his legs. They pulled him out. There were 4 officers. There's no reason in the world why 4 officers can't control a subject who is already handcuffed without putting him into a chokehold, or for that matter, using any type of force. I mean, that was a situation where there was no force necessary. The situation involving out of Louisville, Kentucky, on the no-knock search warrant, I think we're at the point in our law enforcement relations that we have to reserve no-knock search warrants for only the most extreme cases. And I know from my career that that has become kind of a standard. They apply for that, the judge reads it, and he signs off on it, and they hit the house. They used to be able, the reason that they wanted to do it was because they didn't want the drugs flushed down the toilet. And in my opinion, those types of warrants are just as dangerous for the officers as they are for the individuals on the inside of that house, because there's a lot of guns out there today. A lot of people have guns. And when somebody's coming through their door, oftentimes they shoot without even looking to see who it is. And I just don't like it. But having said that, there's going to be a situation where you have a person who is wanted for a very violent crime, and we have good information that he has indicated that he is going to shoot his way out. He is not going to go to jail alive. So that might be a situation strategically where it might be necessary to get the upper hand on him and get in there without announcing yourself. So there's going to be exceptions, but we got to be very careful about the exceptions, and they have to be very few. The situation with in Louisville, the one officer was shooting blindly. We never train our officers to do that. I mean, he literally was shooting blindly at whoever was on the other side of that door, and she was struck and killed. And that's very, very sad and very unfortunate, but that was very careless of the officer. And I mean, those are cases that just have so many things wrong with them. I really don't know where to start. The one in Atlanta with the taser, that's a little bit more difficult, more problematic. I don't really know enough about that one, but you know, sometimes when people run away, you got to let them go. You'll get them another day. I think somebody said, somebody made a comment, there's 10,000 warrants in the city right now. Well, tomorrow we're going to have 10,001. So sometimes you got to let them go. I think when you shoot somebody that's fleeing, it's going to be very, very difficult to justify that. And we have to put policies in place to prevent that from happening. We have to drill that into our officers that it's not acceptable, and we have to train them. And that's a change. I mean, it isn't that long ago, in 1985, that police officers could legally shoot fleeing felons. It took a long time to convince some of these veteran officers that you can't do that anymore. The law has changed, and it's going to change some more. But the chokeholds need to be banned, period. I mean, we don't need those anymore. We have enough other tools to use that we don't have to use chokeholds. You need an extensive amount of training to administer a chokehold. And even when you do everything right, the person can die. And it's happened. It happened in New York 6 years ago with Eric Garner. You would have thought that that would have been a wake-up call for all these other cities across the country And somebody said there were 500 of them that still allow chokeholds. I'm guessing there's not very many that allow it anymore. And they need to pass that on the national level. That's a no-brainer. That's an easy one. Shooting at motor vehicles has got to be prohibited. Those situations oftentimes result in very bad things happening. Now, there'll be exceptions to that. Exception to that would be if someone's in a motor vehicle shooting at the officer. Well, then the officer's probably going to shoot back. There might be a situation like there was in France where the person with the truck plowed through the crowded people and was headed for another crowded people, and they had to shoot him to stop that truck. There's going to be exceptions. I guess whatever rule you make, there's going to be exceptions, but you've got to have very stringent rules, and you have to make sure your officers understand them and that they're trained in them and that they're held accountable. In New York City, 6 years ago, when Eric Garner was put into a chokehold and died, the city of New York had banned chokeholds several years before that, but they never enforced it. And because they never enforced it, it was like it was allowed. So if you make the rules, you have to enforce them.
My final question is, our community and nation are divided on race. It comes down to facts and your thought process. How can police officers do their job without it becoming a death sentence?
Well, I think in order to even get into the conversation, the community is divided, but both sides really need to agree on two things. Number one, I think they have to agree that police officers have a tough job and that they oftentimes have to use force because of the nature of the job. But I think the other side has to acknowledge the fact that not everyone is cut out to be a police officer. Some people get hired that shouldn't get hired. And there are, how do we gain that trust? We like I said, we hold the officers accountable. We do that by mandating the body cams, the dash cams. We mandate training. I think the other thing that you have to admit is police officers have to admit that there are police officers out there that have not only implicit biases, but they have conscious biases, and that they make decisions that are based on a person's race. They may not do it intentionally, but it happens. And I think there has to be an acknowledgement that that happens. They may not know that they're doing it, but we didn't talk about data collection, but we collect data on traffic stops in the city of Oregon. That's one of the standards that was passed by the Ohio Collaborative. And that was very controversial in the state. The chiefs around the state didn't want to do that. But we collect data, and we can look at the number of traffic stops. We can look at the race and the gender of the driver stopped. And we have to communicate with each other. We have to find out, where the problems are. And there are so many things that we can do right now to improve. But we got a long way to go. This is not a problem that's going to be fixed overnight. But there has to be dialogue between both sides, and there has to be progress made. And the status quo just isn't going to do it anymore, because I don't think the community is going to stand for it. I've listened to them. They've been loud and clear. They want change. They want reform. And I'm with them. I agree with them. I don't agree with a lot of the nonsensical things that have been said, but some of this it makes a whole lot of sense, and we need to do it. We need to do it quickly. And I think that is going to go a long way toward building that trust back to where it needs to be. Again, it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in the next 6 months to a year. It's going to take time, but we have to continue to make progress.
Oregon Police Chief Mike Navarre, thanks for joining me.
You're very welcome. Thank you.